Right, so hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I decided to stump up the cash a couple months ago and buy the X-Pro1. This camera now is coming up to about its 10-year anniversary this year, which is quite old these days for a digital camera. So I got a good deal for this camera. It cost me about £250. I say good, it was a good deal from an X-Pro1 point of view because generally they go for a lot higher than that, albeit that price was twice what I paid for the X-E1. So why did I bother getting the X-Pro1 when I had the X-E1? So basically, when I was doing some research around the internet, anecdotally people still preferred the X-Pro1 over the X-E1. Yeah, so as I like the X-E1 so much, I really wanted to then get an X-Pro1 to see whether it was worth it over the X-E1. And spoiler alert, you'll find out that I still prefer the X-E1, but I thought I'd explore today in a video as to why that is the case. Yeah, so both these cameras have been installed with the latest versions of their firmware, and I say latest, probably their last versions of the firmware. Apologies that I'm back to this mill again for filming this video, but it's a really nice kind of location near to where I live that doesn't really get that many people. Yes, it's a little bit noisy in terms of the sewage treatment plant behind the camera, the recycling centre, also known as the tip, that way, and then of course the river which runs through this scene to the kind of the mill or the old mill behind. But what I'll do to just kind of make it a little bit more interesting is I'll move the camera a little bit around so you can get a different kind of view of this mill. Yeah, so I'll talk about their similarities and the differences of why you might want to choose one over the other. And then I will talk about those aspects which mattered to me and basically informed my decision as to which one of these cameras I prefer. There's obviously lots of videos out there which go into these cameras in quite a lot of detail. So I'm just going to kind of concentrate on the main kind of differences between these two cameras. So starting with the X-Pro1, it's obviously a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier than the X-E1. It's got a hybrid viewfinder, the X-Pro1, so you can select between the electronic viewfinder and then its hybrid optical viewfinder. The LCD screen on the back is a little bit bigger than the one on the X-E1, and also it is a higher resolution. The flip side is that the X-E1 has a higher resolution EVF, but we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. The other thing to note with this camera, the X-Pro1, is that it's got a lockable shutter dial switch, so you can't move it while the dial button is kind of depressed. So I guess it prevents you from knocking it, but I've never really had that much of an issue with it on the X-E1. Yeah, so moving on to the X-E1, obviously it is a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter than the X-Pro1. It doesn't have an optical viewfinder, but it has a very good EVF and it has a higher resolution than the X-Pro1. It doesn't have quite the same resolution to its LCD screen and it's a little bit smaller, but for me it doesn't really matter that much, I find. It also has a pop-up flash, the X-E1, there we go, albeit I don't really use it a great deal. No lock on the shutter dial, but like I said, I don't really find that too much of a problem. Another thing to note as well is both cameras will do a mechanical cable release to fire off the shutter, but the X-E1 I believe will also do it electronically as well. So why these cameras are so popular still today, nearly 10 years on from their inception, is that they both have the same processor and 16 meg X-Trans1 image sensor in them. Although I think because the X-E1 is slightly newer than the X-Pro1, I do feel that it might have benefited from a little bit more kind of development times in the hands of the Fuji designers. And as a result, I do find there are kind of subtle differences that make this camera, in my opinion, better than the X-Pro1. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail later on in the relevant kind of section. Right, so both of these cameras have got a similar size kind of viewfinder, but the X-E1 wins hands down because it has a diopter on its side here. So basically, those of us who wear glasses, we can remove them temporarily and get right up and close to the viewfinder to see much more of the scene in front of you, so you can better kind of compose your kind of scenes. This is vitally important, especially when you're using adapted lenses on these cameras, because you can achieve, I find, critical focus a lot easier when you're using the diopter and you've got your eye right up to the viewfinder on the X-E1. I still get good results with the X-Pro1 with adapted lenses, but I just find that it's easier to kind of compose and achieve that kind of manual focus with its kind of focus peaking, which both of these cameras have on the X-E1. The higher resolution on the X-E1 also matters as well. I believe it's about 2.4 million dots as opposed to 1.4 million dots on the X-Pro1, and that extra resolution really does help kind of compose your scene. I also find as well that whether it's to do with the X-E1 having a larger eye point, i.e. the distance that the viewfinder is away from the actual electronic viewfinder screen in the camera, but I couldn't find any definitive information on that on the internet. But from my use, I just find that when I'm using glasses and I don't want to kind of bother taking them off, I do generally find that I can see more of the scene using the X-E1 than I do with the X-Pro1. Yeah, so even though it's got a lower resolution in its EVF, I was expecting better performance though than the X-E1, because apparently the lower resolution makes for a reduced kind of lag experience when using the viewfinder, but I didn't really find in real world use that made much of a difference. Right, so the next kind of similarity is this kind of rear command dial on both of these cameras. I find the X-E1's much better. It just seems a lot more kind of robust, and certainly when you're using the kind of the 15 to 45 lens here that I've got attached to the X-Pro1, where you need to use that rear command dial for changing the aperture, and I don't find it to be as reliable compared to the X-E1. So yeah, definitely a point there for the X-E1. It just definitely feels a lot more robust in its kind of construction. Both of them work fine as advertised to depress them in terms of accessing the camera's ability to magnify a scene for using adapted lenses with, but on the whole, because I do rely on that dial to change the aperture for this 15 to 45 lens, I do prefer using it on the X-E1. Another slight difference is the X-Pro1 was supposed to have a bit better build quality, because this is the more kind of premium range camera as opposed to the X-E1. But when I got this camera, you can probably see it now, I thought the shiny kind of magnesium body almost looks a little bit plasticky, whereas the X-E1 for me, other than the fact that my copy is a little bit more worn, so the paint is starting to kind of flake away, the construction of it is pretty similar, to be honest, so I couldn't really tell them apart in terms of their build quality. But it just feels, I just feel that the X-Pro1 almost felt a bit kind of hollow, whereas the X-E1 just feels a lot more kind of substantially built in the hands, and none of that kind of hollowness feel to it. It just feels more kind of solid, I guess. You definitely can't argue that the screen quality from the X-Pro1 is absolutely amazing, much better than that on the X-E1. But to be honest, how much do you use the rear screen? It's great on both cameras to compose with, but I don't tend to kind of review my images on the back of the screen. I save that for when I'm back home on the computer, so it's a nice to have, but I think overall I prefer the smaller one on the X-E1 just because it helps with that kind of smaller form factor camera that I kind of prefer. And like I said, the size of it and the quality of it is good enough for me to kind of compose and review images as needed. It's just not as high quality as the one on the X-Pro1. One small point, but the only real difference on the back of these cameras is the position of the kind of the playback button, and I do prefer again the X-E1 here with the button over the left hand side of the body, because that's kind of then closer to the other kind of buttons that you use when you're reviewing your images, so like the zoom in, zoom out, and then that kind of delete key. So there's the button there, whereas it's above the kind of the dial over this side, but as soon as you press it, you're back over here using these buttons. So that's why I think it's much better positioned on the back of the X-E1. Obviously, the X-Pro1 is the only one out of the two that has the optical viewfinder, which you can switch with this switch here on the front. But generally, I haven't really used it a great deal. I did use it a lot when I had the original X100 camera, but I think at the time I'd never used a kind of an optical viewfinder in a digital camera before, so it was kind of a bit of a novelty for me at first. But I tend now to kind of rely more on the EVF because I want to kind of get a sense of what the final image is going to look at. And of course, the OVF doesn't work with kind of adapted lenses, and with larger lenses they tend to encroach into the kind of the viewfinder's kind of view. So that's why I think I generally favour the EVF. Right, so that was a quick canter through the differences, the similarities, and some of the specific aspects of the cameras that I kind of prefer and kind of utilise. Right, so let's move on to probably the highest weighted attribute when I'm kind of determining which cameras I prefer, and that is its ability to render an image and the quality of the images that they kind of produce. So what I'll do first is I'll just stick up a montage of images that I've captured and amassed with these two cameras over the last few months, and I've also used some adapted lenses as well in these comparisons, although I didn't tend to use the adapted lenses too much because I was trying to be clever and use a kind of a 50mm Konica lens on one camera and a 50mm Olympus lens on another camera. And while the focal lengths kind of matched, I did find that the Konica lens does have a better kind of feel and contrast to the images over that of the Olympus OM 50mm. So it didn't really kind of make for a fair kind of comparison. And similarly as well, I did think that I could use a tripod to make the kind of the compositions the same, but the problem is because they're kind of different sizes and the kind of the holes on the bottom of the camera for mounting a tripod to are in a different position, it kind of did make for a subtly different composition, which complicated on where I was trying to focus those images. So the comparisons with the tripod didn't work as well as I was kind of expecting to. So I've used a mix of all of these methods in the upcoming montage, and as always I've tried to do my best to kind of match the kind of the scene. The lighting conditions are probably more critical. You know, there's no point taking an image when it's kind of like today, flat and overcast, and another image when the sun is breaking through the clouds. So I've tried to be as fair as I could in these compositions. Yes, I'll put up the comparisons now, and then we'll have another discussion afterwards of which kind of images I kind of prefer and which camera that they belong to. So yeah, as you could probably see, I don't really think there's any difference in kind of image quality or the way that these camera render those images. I just found that the X-E1 was more consistent in the way that it exposed the scene. Sometimes the X-Pro1 image looked a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, but I think that's really personal preference, and it's a reason why both these cameras have an exposure compensation dial on the top of them, so you can kind of easily tune that in to whatever your kind of preferences is, or you can do that in post depending on what you feel the image should be like. So as you can see, I've amassed so many images that I've taken. I think the problem was I didn't really know when to stop. You know, I was trying to find that edge that one of the cameras might have had over the other in terms of which one of these I should stick with. So there's not really a lot else to say really in terms of image quality. I think it's definitely a draw for both of these cameras. So let's move on now to probably the next highest weighted attribute in this kind of decision making process, and that's the kind of the handling of the cameras. Right, for this aspect, I'm definitely going to say that the X-Pro1 is better than the X-E1. I just feel because it's kind of slightly bigger in the hand, it just fits in it a little bit better, and it just feels nicer to hold somehow. And there's a lot more kind of space on the back with the buttons, so there's a lot more kind of space this side for your thumb, and then on the front there's a lot more space between the kind of the grip and where the lens kind of starts, so you kind of don't feel that you kind of your position in is cramped. It's just a nice kind of camera to hold. Whereas you compare that to the X-E1 here, and you'll see that the fingers are butted right up to the lens, so there's certainly a lot less space at the front, and it just feels a little bit kind of more pointy at the bottom. So to help with this on the X-E1, I have bought the extra kind of thumb grip that just kind of plugs in like so. So that gives you a much better kind of position for your thumb to be on the right hand side. And then I've also bought a kind of an extra grip which attaches to the base plates and gives you a bit of extra grip, and then the base plate just makes it feel a little bit better in the hand. I'll just stick that on now. So here it is. Almost costs half of what the camera's worth, but I feel that it was worth it. So it just goes on there. It's a really good design, this plate, to be honest. You've still got access to the battery and the SD card at the bottom, and cleverly the base plate is Arca plate compatible, so it can fit into any kind of Arca supported tripod, and that's just brilliant. And then of course you've got the grip on the front just to give you a bit more kind of space. Then you can see there's a bit more space now between my hand and the lenses, but of course you don't need this with the X-Pro1 because it already feels pretty good in the hands. And what I generally do find as well is this base plate, because it's kind of metallic and it's a bit pointy, it does stick into that palm a little bit more, so it doesn't make it for a very kind of comfortable experience. So I tend not to use the base plate until I know I'm going to be using the camera on a tripod. But like I said, that's such a useful kind of function of this plate, to provide extra kind of grip as well as that kind of Arca support. But like I said, by the time you've put the thumb grip as well and the base plate, the size difference is pretty much up there with the X-Pro1. So there's the X-Pro1 now, and then there's the X-E1 with obviously the extra thumb grip and base plate. So it pretty much brings it up to the same kind of size, defeating the kind of the compact nature of the X-E1. But you can take the grip off, so that's not so bad. But the thumb grip hardly takes up any room, so I just kind of tend to keep that on because it does dramatically improve the kind of the handling of this camera, like it did for the X100 that I had. This camera is probably better for those kind of larger lenses and the bigger kind of adapted lenses, because I just feel that they were more kind of balanced on this camera. Right, so let's talk about adapted lenses on these two cameras. And I said it earlier, the X-E1 is better in this regard because you've got the diopter equipped viewfinder. For non-glasses wearers, this isn't an issue, but for those of us who wear glasses, it's great to be able to kind of get right up into that viewfinder to help, especially with manual focus lenses, achieve that kind of critical focus. And this is where I talked about it earlier, with the kind of the subtle differences in the way that these cameras operate. And one of those subtleties is the way that these cameras kind of do focus peaking. Both of them offer the same primitive one color white focus peaking ability, but I just found when using the X-E1 that the focus peaking showed up a lot better, whether that's to do with the higher resolution EVF. But sometimes I was using the X-Pro1 and I had to go into the settings to check that focus peaking was on, because it wasn't really kind of showing a great deal when I was composing particular kind of subjects. And I tried it with multiple lenses and it just seems to really struggle with focus peaking. Thankfully you can, like on the X-E1, click the rear command dial when you've selected the front switch to manual mode, and you can magnify into a scene, so that will then allow you to achieve a focus. But I do find for this purpose the X-E1 is obviously better, because for some reason I just found that focus peaking a lot better with this camera. Yeah, so hopefully that kind of starts making you think about what other kind of improvements did the Fuji engineers make to the X-E1, despite them having the same kind of sensor and processor. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more detail next. Yeah, so let's talk about some of those subtleties in a little bit more detail. I've already talked about the fact that I do find that focus peaking is better on the X-E1. It just seems to show up a lot clearer, and it just made kind of using adapted lenses easier, basically. Another one of those subtleties is, I know these cameras aren't renowned for their fast autofocus, but I definitely found that the focus ability of the X-E1 was much better than the X-Pro1. And this was certainly the case when I was doing the kind of the Christmas light comparison. And I put these images up again now, but I basically struggled with the X-Pro1, really had a hard time locking on the focus. So in some situations I had to switch to kind of manual focus to achieve that kind of composition. I also found as well that the X-E1 generally was a lot faster in those conditions to lock on. Yeah, so I was really surprised at the differing performance in autofocus between these two kind of cameras. And the final thing that I noticed that was subtly better with the X-E1 was the way it kind of meted a scene. Like I talked about earlier, I found that the X-E1 was more consistent in the way it kind of presented a scene that I kind of captured. The X-Pro1 kind of either made it darker or brighter, but the X-E1 just seemed to nail the metering in every kind of scene that I presented it with. And another thing as well, I found that when I was kind of looking through the viewfinder or on the LCD screen at the scene in front of me, I just felt like the X-E1 was again quicker at kind of showing me what that scene was going to look like when I kind of pressed the shutter and captured the image. So it's getting pretty dark now, and I think that's pretty much the main kind of points that I wanted to cover. So I'll just move to a slightly lighter position, not under the canopy, to basically wrap up this video, which is probably going to be quite lengthy. Yeah, so let's make some kind of conclusions from this video today, because that's kind of what you're interested in, hopefully. And it's what I'm interested in. You know, I don't want to keep both of these cameras. I just want to kind of keep the one that I'm more likely to use and the one that's going to kind of give me the results that I'm after. Yeah, so critically, what makes me prefer the X-E1 over the X-Pro1 is that EVF and the diopter. You know, for people wearing glasses, the ability to kind of see the whole scene and be able to compose that scene correctly is just great, you know. And also as well, I do find with the X-E1, even with my glasses on, it's much easier to kind of see a whole scene, whereas the X-Pro1 more feels cut off, so to speak. Yes, the handling on the X-Pro1 is better than that of the X-E1, but that's probably its only kind of positive that I can see that would make me want to kind of keep the X-Pro1 over the X-E1. And it's not kind of enough for me to kind of choose it, because like I mentioned earlier as well, the kind of the subtleties and changes that the Fuji engineers managed to kind of put into this camera in the few extra months it had in its kind of development time have really seemed to kind of help its performance in terms of using adapted lenses and that focus peaking ability, as well as, in my opinion, the faster kind of autofocus ability, certainly in lower light, and also the more kind of consistent way that it kind of meters and exposes for a scene. That's a very kind of subtle difference, because you might prefer that kind of darker or brighter look that the X-Pro1 kind of produces at times, but that's easily kind of correctable using the kind of the exposure compensation dial on the X-E1, or adjust it to suit in post. And I'm sure as well that these kind of differences pale into comparison compared to some of the newer cameras in Fuji's lineup, but for me they lose then that kind of character that the original X-Trans1 sensor provides these two cameras in the way that they kind of render a scene. And that's for me why I'm sticking with the original X-Trans1 sensor, and more importantly sticking with the X-E1. And as a result of that, I will be looking to sell on the X-Pro1. So to finish this video, I'll just put some of my favourite images that I've captured with both of these cameras in the making of this video. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.